Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach, and you are listening to another episode of Timeless Dialogues, where we try to discuss issues related to theology, philosophy, apologetics, and politics. And people sometimes wonder, well, why would you ever want to talk about things related to politics? Well, it's because in many ways, it's one of the best expressions of one's theology, philosophy, and even sometimes apologetic methodology. So today what we're going to do is we're going to discuss a whole host of issues as they relate to many of the cultural hot button topics that so many people that we know in society have bought into, namely things like the 1619 Project, issues about voter suppression, Black Lives Matter, and the idea or supposed idea of systemic racism. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this, and many people probably wonder, well, why are we talking about this specifically as it might relate to things related to the evangelical church? Well, for anybody who has watched anything as it relates to many of the larger Protestant denominations and even things that are non-Protestant, people within the church have adamantly bought into many of the concepts of wokeness or systemic racism and all the rest. And people sometimes wonder, well, how in the world do you even define the concept of wokeness? And I go, well, it's very simple. It's a network of neo-Marxist conspiracy theories, and they relate to one's epistemology, which is how we know things, but also how we educate people, how we engage in politics, how we engage in business and finance. Namely, it's the diversity, inclusion, and equity bandwagon that everybody is bought into, and they try to hold the moral high ground. So what we're going to do is we are looking at these topics, and yet we're also trying to revamp some of the things that we have done. We are trying to streamline this to meet many of your needs so that we are filling a void within the apologetics world. So what we're going to do today is we are going to look at probably one of the funniest videos that I have seen that refute absurdity with absurdity. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to go through this new book. Well, it's been out for a little while now by James Golden, aka Bo Snerdley, titled Rush on the Radio. And what this book is it is James Golden's attempt, and I would say very successful attempt, to display the true wit and wisdom of Rush Limbaugh. Now, some people are probably wondering, why in the world are you talking about Rush Limbaugh on your show? And I go, well, first and foremost, it's because Rush Limbaugh, probably better than any single figure out there, readily addressed these ideological issues facing American society. Second of all, I will just lay my cards on the table that I probably learned how to engage these issues from Rush Limbaugh better than any other figure that I've ever met. Why? It's because he wasn't afraid to actually address the issues for what they are and to refute them for the absurdity that they communicate. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at this book as it relates to the key topics of ideological notions found in the 1619 Project, the ideas of voter suppression and white supremacy and systemic racism and all the rest, all the buzzwords that are on every different television show and news outlet. And sadly enough, maybe even coming from the pulpits of your church. If not directly from the pulpits of your church, they're coming from many of the graduates of our seminaries, and definitely, most definitely, from many of the campus ministries that you might be sending your son or daughter off to later this year. So in order to do this, we have started this new thing called Realville. Now, Realville is something that was made famous by Rush Limbaugh, in which he illustrates and refutes absurdity with absurdity. So some people may wonder, what in the world goes on with this? Well, Rush tells us. He says, I live in Realville, and my problem is that I'm governed by logic, and some of the claims that are made by people on the left just don't hold up. Have you ever noticed this? And we say this over and over and over again, that if you have ever been trained in critical thinking, logic, formal fallacies, informal fallacies, and you go and you watch the left, you see nothing more than just irrational emotionalism. And whatever they do in one arena, they seem to undercut in a different arena. But the reality is that one of the best ways to engage the society today is you can't deal rationally and logically with some of these leftists. Sometimes you just have to refute their positions by destroying absurdity with absurdity. And people say, well, you can't do that. You're mocking them. Well, no, we're not. It's actually a great debater's tactic called reductio ad absurdum. We reduce things unto absurdity. So what I want to do today is I want to go through and we are going to discuss what this is going to look like as it relates to probably one of the funniest videos that I have seen. Now, I was very, very hesitant to show this just because I know sometimes evangelicals get overly pietistic, but I said to myself, no, I'm not going to let that keep me from engaging this video because I think it does it better than probably anything that I have seen. And we can actually learn from it and see how to refute the concept of white privilege that is just prevalent throughout our society. So, with that being said, what might we be ready to look at with no further ado? Let's pull it up here. In this video here, sorry. We must back up. We must have the proper introduction to our video.
Trumpet fanfare update time. Here we go, ladies and gentlemen.
And now we are ready. We're going to pull this up here, and I'm going to play it under fair use privileges and fair use laws for all of you who might not want me to show it here. This is an episode from an apparent newly released movie from, yes, Beavis and Butthead, that old show that your mother or father probably never let you watch. But the reason I show it is, like I said, it refutes absurdity with absurdity. So we're going to play it, break it down, discuss the concepts, and show how they can apply for your ability to engage this issue. So let's get started here.
This is a classic example of white privilege, and you both have it.
What's that?
Anyone want to fill them in?
Notice this. Notice what's going on here right from the very beginning. This video is assuming that our characters, Beavis and Butthead, have no clue what they're talking about. They're the uneducated, naive individual that hasn't been enlightened by the present day academy. The second thing to notice is that this is actually what's going on in the universities today. All of these universities are teaching these different ideologies, which is exactly what they are. They're not just academic trends. They're not just the latest research. They're not just showing the preponderance of truth in every respect. No, they're ideologies that are pushing things that are contrary to not only self-evident principles, but the very things this country was founded upon. So let's look at how they're actually going to explain what white privilege is by our enlightened student group here.
Yeah, I'll do it. Okay, so white privilege is when white people, particularly men, automatically assume they can take whatever they want. And
did you notice that? Who are the two things, or what are the two things that are most dominantly given here? It's white people in general, but white men in particular. And notice who's actually having to fill them in on this. It's a woman. In particular, you're going to find that it's not only going to be women, it's going to be minority women that start to speak to it. And you may say, well, that's just such a racist, sexist thing to say. No, because according to what is known as standpoint epistemology, the idea is that in order for you to have knowledge about this, the oppressed groups must speak these things to you so that you can trust them for the knowledge that's taking place. So, point being, men don't understand women, and white men don't understand what it's like to be a black woman in particular. So they're going to inform us about these truths. They're going to educate us like the priesthood of the modern day academy.
they never have to worry about getting stopped by the police. And they have the inside track for any job
I've got this one, Aisha. They have the inside track for any job they want.
Notice that right there. Notice what just happened. This is a person who we would label as a McWokey, namely somebody that is totally bought into this ideology, and he's very familiar with the contours and the details of it, but he's a white man. Notice what he did? He stepped right into this African-American woman's life and completely cut her off, hence illustrating his white privilege. Now notice how this teacher is going to respond to them.
Exactly, Gage. Thank you for that. That's white privilege.
Whoa. And we have that?
You sure do.
I see.
Whoa, I never realized this stuff.
Yeah, you've really opened up my eyes.
Well, I'm glad we've been able to enlighten you. The real question is, do you think you'll be acting differently from now on?
I guarantee it.
Yeah, me too, yeah.
Notice what happened here. They were confronted with these ideas and they were told you need to act differently. You need to show your grievance. But here's the reality of it. Beavis and Butthead aren't going to do exactly what they want. They're going to apply it the way that it probably would be applied in society by people who, if they actually have white privilege, would live in society. And look at how they're going to do this in the next several seconds, probably half a minute of this video.
Step aside, please. We have white privilege.
Yeah, check it out. Hey. No.
Taking food.
Don't worry, it's okay. We automatically assume we can take what we want, and we don't have to worry about the police.
No police control.
They didn't either. Good stuff now.
This is what we were taught, sir.
Educated beyond their means.
Subverting existing paradigms.
Did you notice that? Subverting existing paradigms. Children come home from school and says that they have a whole new vocabulary that sounds just like that because it's woke ideology.
This rules. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad we went to college.
Yeah, it's like,
Do you notice? Where did they learn it? College. Listen to the very next comment here.
now I have the skills for today's workplace.
You better believe they have the skills for today's workplace. Why? Because today's workplace is completely dominated by diversity, inclusion, and equity trainings. And what you find is that in order to enter into the workforce today, you must buy into these dominant ideologies. But notice how this last section is going to play in. If they really have this white privilege and the police can't touch them, well, why not go steal a police car? And we wonder why society is falling apart.
Well, let's see. What should we take next? Let's take that car.
But that's a police car.
Beavis, you dumbass. Didn't you hear?
Sorry for the cussing. It is Beavis and Butthead.
We don't have to worry about getting stopped by the police.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Beavis, let's tear ass.
Now, what I want you to do is this. I want you to see and listen to exactly the words that they say in response to these police officers.
That was cool.
Don't move!
Sir, maybe you didn't know, but we have white privilege.
Get your hands where I can see them!
I think the problem is you're just uneducated.
Yeah, we're gonna get jobs on Wall Street.
Do you see how it works? Do you see what's going on? And do you see why we chose this video? They are refuting absurdity with absurdity. These people are going to get jobs on Wall Street. You're uneducated, my friend. But this is exactly what goes on here. So again, why do we look at this? Rush Limbaugh says it. I live in Realville. And my problem is that I'm governed by logic. And if the logic of this claims that we have this by necessity and it cannot go away, and it is something that will be with us for the rest of our lives, then why not use it to our benefit? But if we did use it to our benefit, this is what society would look like. But we don't find that happening. And notice this, and some of the claims that are made by people on the left just don't hold up. The reality is that leftists act this way. Those on the right, you hardly ever find them acting this way. So what I want to do today is I want to transition into our second subject here, Rush on the Radio with James Golden, aka Bo Snerdley. And the reason that I want to look at this book is that he addresses these exact topics and he brings to light a lot of the internal irrational concepts that can be found within them. And we're just going to walk through each one of them in order to discuss them a little bit at length. And hopefully you can take some of the points found in this and apply it to probably your workplace, family, holiday gathering, or whichever. So we're going to go through this PowerPoint here to help us understand what is going on. So we talk about this. Rush on the radio, and he has a chapter titled, Let's Go There. And he's specifically going to the areas of the 1619 Project, Black Lives Matter, the concept of systemic racism, and the notion of voter suppression, which is supposedly the exact way that systemic racism and all these different ideas are still working their way out into politics. So a few things that we need to look at before we go in here. James Golden, aka Bo Snerdley, was the call screener for Rush Limbaugh. He probably took thousands upon thousands of calls from people calling in to interact with the real mayor of Realville himself. But also notice this, James worked to engage many of the ideas Rush presented on his show. Rush didn't just have him as an individual who was answering the phones and sitting by the sidelines. Rush truly took to heart and listened to what James Golden had to say. And that's one of the points that you find in this book, which I highly recommend that you buy, is that you see James Golden coming to be this dominant black conservative voice within American politics. And the reason is that he said that he's not going to be confined by what one party says he has to believe. He's going to go out and do the research for himself, and he's going to try to see if they hold up to what he thinks the facts and logic grant and give him. But there's also this famous quote that's within the book that we're going to use to help us give our analysis of these concepts today, because people probably wonder, well, Bill, why do you want to address these things? You don't have the privilege to address them. Well, notice this. We're going to take a little tactic from Rush's playbook. And he says this: the EIB network now has an official Obama criticizer, aka Bo Snerdley. He says, when Obama needs to be criticized, our official criticizer, Bo Snerdley, will do so. Well, today we are hiring, free of charge, the official Obama criticizer. But he's not just going to criticize Obama. He's going to criticize all of these ideologies because he can do so since he speaks from that privileged standpoint. So this is not just me talking about it. This is not just Rush Limbaugh talking about it. This is James Golden talking about it. And these are direct quotes from his book with some commentary by myself. So notice this, the 1619 Project. And this is what Rush says. He says, so the New York Times is suggesting that that's the date that America really began, 1619, when slaves first came, and therefore the New York Times points out that everything that's happened since then has happened on the backs of slaves. Whatever America is, whatever America has accomplished, whatever America has achieved has been illegitimate, has been tainted, is unjust, is immoral, because it's built on the backs of slaves. So you hear a lot of talk about the 1619 Project, and this is exactly what they're trying to do, is they're trying to say that when America was first founded, namely in 1619, it was built upon slavery. So all of the laws, all of the financial transactions, all of the commerce, all of the ways that we have functioned in society are built upon the basic structures of a racist society. But notice what James Golden has to say about this. He says, the project's originally stated goal in Nicole Hannah-Jones' 2019 editorial in the New York Times was to reframe the country's history and bring racism and slavery into our historical narrative. He goes on to say, one of her assertions was that the country's actual founding was in 1619, when the first slaves were brought to Virginia. For this, she won a Pulitzer Prize in 2020. But notice this, stick with me here. But her version of history is and was biased and incorrect. The New York Times even made corrections to her article, but did so without the usual notices. So notice this, the New York Times ran this article and it was found to have dozens, if not more, factual errors within it, but they swept it under the rug. Notice how he says here, they did so, they made the corrections without the usual notices. And one of the things that it's trying to do is it's trying to reframe the country's history in order to communicate, as Rush Limbaugh has said, whatever America is, whatever America has accomplished, whatever America has achieved has been illegitimate. We are an illegitimate country. We no longer have the privilege that we think we do. There's no longer the American exceptionalism that we have been taught. You are all wrong. Why? It is tainted by racism. We are unjust because of racism, and we are immoral because of racism, namely because our society was built upon the backs of slaves. Now, notice this. Nobody's trying to say that slavery is a good thing or a righteous thing or a just thing. Nobody on the side of the right is making that kind of claim, even though that claim is being put in the mouths of those on the right. But the facts of the matter just don't stand up. So let's continue going here. We need to have the official Obama criticizer speaking again. He says this, stating that America really began in 1619 also misses the point, because the United States was founded in 1776. Just because somebody came to the United States in 1619, or even actually prior to that, as he's going to say, doesn't mean that we were founded in 1619. That's a very blanket, straightforward, historical inaccuracy. And he goes on to say this, and if you really want to go back to the history of the Americas, go back to the 1500s and say Augustine, Florida, which is the oldest city in America. Historians are rediscovering what a true melting pot this city was from its beginning. Notice this key point. Various cultures and races, including blacks, lived together freely and peacefully in St. Augustine. End quote, James Golden. Do you see what he's saying here? You see the importance of what he's saying here? There's two major points. First of all, the country was not founded in 1619. And second of all, if you go back to the 1500s, prior to 1619, you actually had blacks in the United States of America who were free members of society, acting and living peacefully and freely with all other races in society. The facts don't hold up to the 1619 project. He goes on to say, the project's narrative is that white people are evil and that white men are the worst of the bunch. That's an ignorant perspective that completely ignores world history and American history. As we've discussed, white male leaders and citizens gave their lives to try to right the wrongs of slavery. And the very fact that a black professor like Hannah Jones is in a position of influence, along with an ever-growing number of her peers, negates her argument. If we're going to try to argue with the way history is taught, we at least ought to be intellectually and factually honest, which they're not. They're not. Why? Because if you look at this, one major thing that he talks about is the fact that white male leaders and citizens gave their lives to try to right the wrongs of slavery. Yes, there were white men that owned slaves, but there were white men that also freed slaves, gave their lives for that project, fought wars for that project, passed laws for that project, gave specific amendments for that project in order to free slaves, to right the wrongs of a historical injustice that was done in society. But in addition, if this is still going on, if society is still being dominated by this, how could a person like Hannah Jones rise to such a position of influence? And where we live down the road, she was almost offered a tenure position at UNC Chapel Hill. But yet she was given a tenure position somewhere else. And the reason she wasn't given it at UNC Chapel Hill was because they found her work to be so historically flawed. But yet, in light of the media fiasco, she was given a position elsewhere. So we agree with what he's saying here. If you're going to try to argue this way, at least be intellectually and factually honest, which they're not. But it's not just Hannah Jones that's risen to this level of prestige. We find it in every business, every diversity officer or kingdom diversity officer that we find within evangelicalism doing these exact same kinds of things. So let's keep going here. He goes on to say this: whenever Democrats face a crisis, the first thing they do is pull out the black pawn and say, what you are doing is, wait for it, racist. If you want to lower taxes on corporations, it's racist. If you don't want to raise the minimum wage, which raises unemployment, by the way, it's racist. Notice this. No matter what the policy argument is, one of the first things Democrats usually do is call it racist. And the result is a culture of perceived victimhood. If you're told that every single thing that you engage and everything that you experience in society is somehow the nexus and the outworking of systemic racism, then you are constantly living in victimhood. So how do we respond to it? What can we say to this? Well, I think James Golden gives us a great response. He says this: the 1619 Project is a distraction. As always, proponents will seek to gain personal power and profit. Regardless, let's offer an alternative. And the alternative is this: you're not a constant victim. You are not determined by your circumstances. And we have thousands upon thousands of people who have lived the American dream who serve as counterexamples to such things. For example, you find people like Bo Snerdley himself who have done this. You find countless individuals from all races that have come from poverty and overcome. And that's the beauty of the American dream. The beauty of the American project is that if you work hard and you diligently pursue the things that are true, good, and beautiful, you don't have to stay as a constant victim if you ever were a victim in the actual first place. Now, I will grant there are some people who are in dire circumstances, but they don't have to be. That's the beauty of America. But notice this: the 1619 Project, and I would actually say all of these projects, are just one big distraction. They're means by the Democrats to gain political power by calling their opponents nothing more than racists. So the next one that he talks about, Black Lives Matter. And I know that there are a lot of things related to Black Lives Matter and a lot of specific events that we're not going to get into, but I just want us to look at the very concepts of Black Lives Matter. And notice this: Rush often spoke about this, or he spoke often on and off the air about what BLM really is. Quote, Black Lives Matter, by the way, is simply the rebirth of Occupy Wall Street under racial auspices. You notice that? It is a manufactured left-wing agitator group made to look like an organic neighborhood community organized group. It is bought and paid for. It has a mission, which is to agitate and attack. Now, Rush goes on to say this, talking about following the money. He says, look how quickly the political movement behind all of this has been able to affect this kind of change. They've turned a bunch of white, millennial young people into people that hate law enforcement on the basis that it's white supremacy, it's white privilege, or what have you. Nothing could be further from the truth, but that's how successful they have been in their political efforts. This is exactly what the BLM movement is. It's the Occupy Wall Street group under the heading, under the cloak of racial auspices. They are paid for. They've got a mission. They use every opportunity to fulfill their goals. But notice what James Golden goes on to say. He says this: if you draw a weapon on police and you get shot too, blank, 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 that's pretty bad. He says you don't pull weapons on police because they have the legal authority to kill you under those circumstances. And most of the time, not all of the time, the civilian in question has a criminal record. Gasp. Sorry, but it's true. And if that criminal wasn't killed by the police, he'd be the last guy you'd want walking around your neighborhood. Much of the BLM outrage is hypocritical. People in the community think, I don't want him near my children, thank you. But when thugs get killed by the police, they become heroes and martyrs. No, many were criminals, and stupid ones at that, for pulling a gun on a cop. End quote. You see, the reality of this is that we live in a nation governed by laws. And if you pull a gun on somebody, you're going to reap what you have just sown. And in these cases, you will lose your life for it. Now, notice what he goes on to say here. He says, and most of the time when you see these stories buzzing around in the media, but not all the time, there can be times. There are rogue bad cops that are out there, like there are rogue bad dentists that are out there, or rogue bad instructors that are out there. We find them everywhere because it's an issue of the human heart. People have sinful hearts that display themselves, but not all the time. The civilian in question has a criminal record. Gasp. Notice how he says sorry, but it's true. And he goes to discuss the fact that this is probably not a figure you'd want your kids walking around with. But yet, when he gets shot by the police, he becomes, as he says here, a hero and a martyr. We see how the illogic of the left falls apart. The BLM narrative is taking sometimes criminals and thugs and turning them into heroes and martyrs. Why? Because white men happened to kill them when they broke the law and tried to pull guns on them. Interesting. This isn't me. Remember, stop right there. This is James Golden, the official EIB Obama criticizer, or the official BLM criticizer today. And remember, this is not me. This is James Golden. Notice this. Juan Williams wrote a very brave column in June 2021. Golden goes on to say he admitted that he was afraid for his life because of the recent surge of homicides by black men against other black men. He cited this statistic. 89% of blacks who were murdered in 2019 were killed by other black people, according to the FBI. If Black lives did matter, then Black Lives Matter would be up in arms about that statistic. And they would hold rallies at every Planned Parenthood center across America where black lives are being terminated before they start. How can Black Lives Matter when they won't address the main driver of black deaths outside of the womb, which is young black men killing other black men? Look what happens in Chicago every single weekend. Notice this quote. Listen to this one. This is the key. This is the kernel. This is the meat and potatoes of what he's going to say. Notice this. Guns are not the problem. The root issue is a fundamental lack of respect for life, which has permeated our culture. End quote. Now let's continue to look at this for the sake of time. He says, to a large degree, BLM and defund the police are funded by leftists, not by people in mostly black communities. You ever notice that? Who's actually giving the money? White liberals? And he goes on to say, in 2020 in Minneapolis, an anti-police nonprofit organization received $500,000 from a George Soros-linked group. As Rush always illuminated, we must follow the money. The strings are being tensioned by rich liberals, and I would add rich white liberals using white guilt. Golden goes on to say, our official BLM criticizer, he says this, BLM exaggerates, distorts, and manipulates certain events, mixes in large doses of white liberal guilt, and ignores the large cultural crisis. Why? Because it's an effective way for their leaders to gain power and money, enabled by the media and the Democrat Party, and many of their leaders have cashed in. Note, since this book has been released, we found that key leaders within BLM have bought homes of hundreds of thousands up to millions of dollars by misappropriating funds for that particular use. Why? Because they can gain power and money through this auspice. So let's continue here. What about the notion of systemic racism? And I remember when all of this was hitting its head and you start to hear people talking about their white privilege and their systemic racism and how systemic racism is 100% true. Well, listen to how James Golden responds to this, because I think we should believe in systemic racism, but maybe defined a little different than what you're used to. And he says this, note here, this is how systemic racism can be defined. I do believe in systemic racism. It's in every blue city in America. And by blue, we mean Democrat-run city in the United States of America that has had power and privilege and money and done nothing for the communities that they have served. He goes on to say this, the left loves to tell us that institutions are systemically racist. No, institutions are institutions. You notice that? Notice what he's saying here. Institutions can't be systemically racist because by definition, the nature of an institution can't be racist. It's an institution. You can have people within an institution that are racist, but institutions are not racist. He goes on to say, there may be instances of racist behavior, but we also have legal remedies for discrimination. If there is a discriminatory behavior, but no corresponding legal action to counter it, either go to court or stop the slogans and stop lying to gain personal power. We live in a country of laws. We live in a country that has passed civil rights laws in regards to racist activity in the financial sector, in the private sector, in the legal sector, frankly, in every sector of society. So if you find something that's truly racist, I will stand with you, and so would James Golden, and so would have Rush Limbaugh to fight such racism. But if you're just using this notion of systemic racism without facts, without logic, without pointing to the realities that we've made true progress in society, you probably need to stop the slogans and stop the lying because it's just a personal power play. He goes on to say this. He gives an example of this. In Queens, New York, my old neighborhood, over the past few decades, the median income of blacks often ranked higher than the median income of whites. How's that systemic racism working out? And he goes on to say that's largely because of a high number of two-parent families who came in from the Caribbean nations, set up as entrepreneurs, worked hard, saved their money, educated their children, and embraced the traditional values middle-class people hold as part of the American dream. You wonder how you can get out of poverty? He gives it to you right there. Let's continue here. He goes on to say, by pointing to a quote from Rush Limbaugh on what this really is, he says, the bottom line is liberalism doesn't work. Socialism doesn't work. It's an off display in front of our face failure. And the only excuse, well, at least we're trying. We love people. We're compassionate. We're trying to do something. Our intentions with the Great Society were to wipe out poverty. Our intentions with the war on poverty were to wipe out poverty. Well, notice this. Rush says, you failed. Well, yeah, but we're not supposed to look at that because my intentions are what count. But I think it's very plain as day. It's one of the sources of my frustration because none of this is theoretical anymore. We don't have to rely on theory to tell people this doesn't work. We've been living it since 1964. End quote. You notice this? Whenever you deal with liberals, well, I trust their heart. I trust their intentions. Well, the reality is that when you look at these theories, you may have good intentions, but they don't work. We have all the material data to prove that point. So let's continue here. And this will be our last one to look at because this is one of the last ones that James Golden, our official voter suppression commentator, speaks about. And we all know what voter suppression is. It's this notion that if you require voter ID or any kind of laws relating to them, you are suppressing with your systemic white racism minority groups so that they can't engage in the political process. And he goes on to say this. American companies run by liberal CEOs like Delta Airlines go along with this, the claim to voter suppression, stupidity. Last time I flew on an airline, I needed to prove who I was about 3 times before I could even get near a jet. No ID, no fly. Yet the CEO and a swarm of penitent liberals, he goes on to say this, bitch and moan, his words, about how unjust it is to ask for proper identification before you vote. Newsflash. Notice this. Notice what he's going to say here. Black people across America have Medicare and Medicaid cards, and they have had to show ID to get them. To have a job or to receive government benefits, you must show ID. Want some cigarettes? Bring your identification. Oh, look at this last one. How about COVID-19? Most sites require some form of ID. End quote. Now notice this. It's not just black people across America who have Medicare, Medicaid. White people have them too. But both races have to show ID. The point is that in order to get any of these government benefits or cigarettes or COVID-19 or any of these other things that society tries to provide for people, you must have an ID. So why is it racist to require an ID to vote? We all know why. Because they're trying to buy votes. In many respects, you need to go look at two voter logs in many areas. You look at those who have died and those who sometimes don't have ID to find voter logs for different respects. And this isn't just talking about a contemporary event. This is talking about the reality of what's been going on for decades in Democrat-run cities and states. But notice this. On the one hand, American citizens whose families have been here for generations are told that it is racist that they should have to present an ID to vote. I really enjoy asking my liberal friends about this. Who runs your city? If it is true that black people don't have identification, why in the past 20 years haven't Democrats made sure that black folks who live in their communities get a piece of ID? They haven't been doing their jobs then, which goes to show they're ineffective. The second question I ask is, how are Republicans suppressing your vote? Democrats in these districts own the districts. Republicans are nowhere near there. How is it possible that Republicans, sneaky little bastards, his quote, not mine, remember, the official voter suppression commentator goes on to say, can go where black Democrats run the community, suppress black people's votes? They're not. Have you noticed this? Democrats run these districts. They have for decades. Republicans have virtually no power in these communities. So how is it Republicans are somehow marginalizing these figures? They're not. But notice this. Stay with me, he says. I'm just getting started. And I think this is probably the strongest argument I've seen in a long time related to voter suppression. At the same time, Democrats broadcast their message to illegal immigrants. Come to the United States, amigo. We'll take you to the DMV and give you a special driver's license. In the same breath, Democrats tell black constituents, yeah, we've been in charge of your neighborhood for 100 years, and you still can't get an ID, poor thing. While they literally create and fund programs to give government-issued identification to illegal immigrants. Does this make sense to anybody except the Democrats? We all know it doesn't. We all know what's been going on, and we all understand the reality of what's been going on. So how does this apply to issues related to the evangelical church, theology, philosophy, apologetics, evangelical politics? Well, I think it speaks for itself. When you see people communicating the leftist narrative, we know that they bought into the leftist premises. And it is our task to destroy every false argument that comes up against the knowledge of Christ, or also to destroy false arguments that leave people believing this garbage, because it truly affects their lives. That's why I'm so adamant about looking at this notion that I live in Realville, and my problem is that I'm governed by logic. And some of the claims that are made by people on the left, all the ones we just talked about, they don't hold up. So what we need to do is we need to return to actually engaging these ideas, refute absurdity with absurdity, call an error, call a falsehood, but stand diligently upon the truth.